We'll call the subcommittee to order. The first thing I'd like to ask unanimous consent that members who are not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing so they can ask questions. Without objection, that is so ordered. I'd like to welcome everybody to the hearing today. It's going to focus, obviously, on how we can build the 21st century infrastructure. And the committee is holding a host of hearings to gather ideas on what Congress can do to achieve this goal. And today we're going to hear ideas from our highways and transit stakeholders. Gathering input from our stakeholders is essential to the process that we use to develop the surface transportation policy. It was valuable in our efforts to pass the FAST Act, which was the first long-term highway bill in a decade. And we're going to continue to need your assistance with future legislation. Even with the additional resources we provided in FAST, the nation's surface transportation system still needs additional investments. And enacting a long-term solution for the Highway Trust Fund is a critical component to ensuring that we can address those needs long into the future. Since passage of the FAST Act, building consensus on a solution to fund surface transportation programs has been a central priority of mine, and it's always been the main priority of the committee. Providing federal funding, certainty for our non-federal partners is vital to planning and building infrastructure for the 21st century. This is a bipartisan issue, and I look forward to working constructively with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, as well as our stakeholders, to ensure that we're going to achieve this goal. A modern infrastructure means a strong America, and an America that competes globally, supports local and regional economic development, and creates jobs. And I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today, and with that, and I look forward, obviously, to the testimony. With that, I'll turn to Ranking Member Norton for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I must say at the outset, I very much appreciate that the subcommittee is holding this hearing to get input on rebuilding our highway systems. I think that's the right way to begin after this hiatus. And the four of us, in a very bipartisan way, led the Congress to pass the first surface transportation bill in a decade in 2015. Well, we realized then that we had not really begun, as important as that achievement was. It is not yet clear on where the Trump administration stands or if it is really serious about real investments in infrastructure. I'm pleased that they speak about infrastructure so often. But I think this committee is right to continue the due diligence that you have begun, Mr. Chairman, to highlight our investment needs and the critical need to actually fund them. Stop talking about it. Let's get some money on the table. Perhaps this hearing can help bring our committee and subcommittee and the administration together on what all agree are urgently needed infrastructure work. We already have a bipartisan majority on this committee about what needs to be done, because earlier this year, 250 members of Congress, that's within this committee and within the Congress generally, with robust representation from both sides of the aisle, joined Chairman Graves and I on a letter to the leadership of the Ways and Means Committee urging a permanent solution, with an emphasis on permanent, to our Highway Trust Fund crisis. In this letter, we specifically urged, quote, any HTF solution, Highway Traffic Fund solution, should entail a long-term, dedicated, user-based revenue stream that can support the transportation infrastructure investments. This strongly bipartisan letter stands in stark contrast to the administration's apparent view that an infrastructure initiative is an opportunity to begin chipping away at the federal government's responsibility to be the steward of our national transportation network. Remember, ever since Eisenhower, we have recognized that this is a network. You can't dice and slice it. It goes from coast to coast. It goes from rural to urban. That's why the responsibility is federal. Based on what we have seen so far from the administration, we may get a White House proposal that contains various incentives designed to boost local, state, and private dollars. Try telling that to the states and localities. Rural areas object to this, and members and senators representing rural areas are predictably strong proponents of keeping the funding streams as they are. So the administration seems to hint that some funding would go to rural areas, and for the great bulk of other areas, there would be federal and local dollars. But there has been an agreement for my entire lifetime, Republican and Democratic administrations alike, that there should be federal grants that fund the entire network. And I am certainly happy to work with rural areas. They feed right into the urban area I represent to ensure that they are treated fairly. When one part of the system is not treated fairly, we all have to jump in. I cannot support an infrastructure bill, of course, that is biased against urban areas, and I suspect that there would be a huge number of members with me on that. I doubt that such a bill could gather a majority from either party. So as an example of what a region looks like, I represent the District of Columbia, which is, of course, a densely populated city in a densely populated region where you see all kinds of construction trades, building more offices, apartments, condos, amenities, in collaboration with the rest of the region. Maryland suburbs, Virginia suburbs, the federal government provides a transportation network for over 6 million people. Now, within this microcosm of our country, congestion, transportation problems, deteriorating bridges are challenges that we face no matter where we live. No part of the region is immune. So I may represent the district, but I believe I represent the entire region, and for that matter, the country when I speak of this region. These same challenges, the challenges I've described in this region, are replicated in all our major urban areas across the nation. Maybe we should stop calling them urban areas, because the rural part of our region feeds straight into these roads and bridges, because that's where they come for the jobs, because that's where the jobs are. So parity in a transportation bill is essential. The top 20 urban areas contribute 52% of the total GDP of our economy. American population is expected to grow by 70 million by 2045, and by 2050, 3/4 of Americans are expected to live in 11 mega regions. We can no more leave behind urban areas than we can leave behind rural areas. It's pretty hard to disassociate one from the other. Urban areas, of course, are the economic engine of the nation. That's why the rural areas need them. If we leave urban areas to fend for themselves largely, then we are ignoring our constitutional mandate to assure the free flow of commerce, allowing bottlenecks to build up and traffic to grind to a halt in major population and commercial centers is backwards and would hurt urban and rural areas alike. Some of our witnesses today support the repeal of the federal ban on tolling interstates, originally enacted to protect drivers from double taxation. A Rasmussen survey found that just 22% of Americans favor pulling tolls on interstate highways for infrastructure maintenance. 3 times as many, or 65%, are opposed to turning the nation's interstate into tolling roads. We should think seriously about the impact on drivers if the federal government incentivizes federal lanes tolled that allow drivers to avoid the congested general purpose lanes. Such schemes, sometimes referred to as Lexus lanes, allow those with disposable income to avoid congestion, yet leave the great majority of drivers stuck in traffic. Just a few miles from here in Virginia are the 495 express lanes. Perhaps some members use them. These use congestion pricing with no price cap to ensure traffic flow remains at least 55 miles per hour in express lanes. No traffic reduction requirement exists for the general purpose lanes that most people use, meaning any congestion benefits reside with those who can afford to pay more. In the same vein, the public-private partnership contract discourages carpooling, of all things, that directly relieves congestion. While HOV vehicles are exempt from tolls if they exceed 24% of total vehicles, Virginia Department of Transportation has to subsidize the lost toll proceeds. This means that the Virginia Department of Transportation is incentivized to discourage carpooling, which is a major instrument for relieving congestion. Finally, this is a particularly bipartisan committee, as our recent transportation and infrastructure legislation shows. However, any adverse treatment to transit investment in an infrastructure package would surely break up this partnership. Perhaps we all remember when there was a bill that failed to get to the floor some years ago because it virtually zeroed out transit. Transit is critical to moving workers efficiently and minimizing congestion in urban areas. We need more, not less of it. Yet the administration in FY 2018, in its budget, continues the false and short-sighted myth that cutting transit funding will somehow solve our transportation funding woes. The opposition to transit is a recipe for congestion. Mr. Chairman, I look forward to hearing from today's witnesses, and I thank you for calling this hearing today.
Thank you, Ms. Norton. I'll now turn to Representative Schuster, Chairman of the full committee, for his comments.
Thank you, Mr. Graves, and thanks for all the witnesses being here. Look forward to hearing from all of you. None of you, I think, are strangers to the committee, from Mr. McKenna, who's actually out there doing it day in and day out in Missouri, and Mr. Roberts and Mr. Booker. Your folks are building the infrastructure of this country. Mr. McCartney, you folks are using it every day. And, of course, Mr. Rogoff, your great and distinguished career down at DOT. It's a really fabulous panel to have before us. We look forward to hearing what you have to say. To me, building a 21st century infrastructure is about jobs. It's about efficiency, moving products, moving people as efficiently, as low cost as we can, ensuring that America is competitive, and making sure we pay for it. Stop kicking the can down the road so that my children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren are going to be stuck with a bill for a road that's been built in the next couple of years. I certainly believe that President Trump is a builder. I think this is certainly an area that he understands. He knows how to build things. He knows how to finance things. And we've been working closely with the administration, trying to figure out the outline, the principles, and we hope to see that soon coming out of the White House. But again, hearing from the stakeholders on your policy and funding priorities is absolutely key to all of this. One thing, as I said, I think we all can agree on is we need to fix the Highway Trust Fund, making sure that there's solutions on the table. Fixing the trust fund will help our non-federal partners, and if you look across the country, 29 states have dealt with it over the last 4 or 5 years, and I don't believe any state legislature has been wiped out, either party for dealing with the funding stream. I know my state of Pennsylvania itself, with a Republican governor, Republican House and Senate, dealt with their funding issue. And one of the things I think, and just following up with a little bit of Ms. Norton was saying about urban, suburban, rural. The gas tax is a regressive tax. In rural America, it does pay more. But in the Pennsylvania experience, and I think this is true all over the country, I'm certain it's true all over the country, although rural folks may pay more in their gas tax, they get back a lot more. You can't build a roadway in rural America. You can't build a road in my district that isn't subsidized to the tune of 50 to maybe 80%. So my folks are going to pay more when they fill up because they use their cars more, but what they get back from the taxpayers or the folks, the users in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, I think it comes back to them, and it's a balance what they get back. So that's something we have to keep in our minds as we go forward, because that will be the cry. It's regressive. But rural America, those folks that have to travel more to get to work, they benefit greatly, I believe. And my district's an example of that. And I think if you go to any rural district in America, you'll see you can't build an interstate highway through rural Pennsylvania or rural Wyoming unless the folks from the urban areas, their dollars are coming out there to make this country connected. So again, I look forward to hearing from you folks today, and I appreciate you spending your time and your experience with us here. I yield back.
Thank you, and we'll now turn to Peter DeFazio, who's the ranking member of the full committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding this hearing, and thanks to the witnesses who traveled here today. I didn't bring my poster, but, you know, the poster of 1956 Life magazine, where the brand new interstate in Oklahoma ends at the Arkansas border in a farmer's field because Arkansas defaulted on their promise to build their section until we had a national highway program, and they got 80% of it paid for by the feds. We are talking about linking America together, a vision that Dwight David Eisenhower had 70 years ago with a national transportation policy. Transportation does not end at state lines. So we need the federal investment. As the chairman said, in fact, it's 24 states, not just 21. 24 states have stepped up, and they have increased revenues, principally with the gas tax. A couple of areas went with wholesale taxes, rack taxes. But they're stepping up. They need a federal partner. It's not enough that they did that. And yes, no one lost their election. No one was recalled. So why are we sitting here, John again today, 9 months, 10 months into the year after the first hearing on our infrastructure needs with no proposals other than a few introduced by people like myself on a bipartisan basis? 2 of my bills for infrastructure have Freedom Caucus sponsors, and the other has Lou Barletta on it. We can do this in a bipartisan way, but all we're doing is talking. That's all we're doing around here is just talking while the country crumbles. I mean, seriously, let's get to work. You know, we have taken, actually the Republicans took a very substantive step last week on transportation and infrastructure. They cut it $25 billion in their budget. So why are we even here pretending? I mean, if that's their priority and they're going to cut it $25 billion, why are they holding a hearing to talk about our needs? You can't meet our needs without investment. We haven't raised the federal gas tax since 1993. When a guy named Bud Schuster brought a bunch of Republicans to vote with the Democrats, and we raised the gas tax. 24 states in just the last couple of years have recognized the need and done it. And there's been no action here. We're promised $1 trillion downtown by the White House, and then they come out with an outline of $200 billion, maybe, sort of, you know, that might just be PPPs. But then the president says he doesn't like PPPs. It's time for someone to take the lead, and this committee should take the lead. It's time to put proposals out and push the House to act. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'd like to welcome our panel. And first, we got Mr. Patrick McKenna, who's the Director of the Missouri Department of Transportation. He's here on behalf of the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials. We've also got Mr. James Roberts, who's President and Chief Executive Officer at Granite Corporation, and he's here on behalf of the Transportation and Construction Coalition. Mr. Brent Booker, who's the Secretary-Treasurer of the North American Building Trades Union. Mr. Ray McCarthy, who's the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Associated Industries of Missouri, and he's here on behalf of the National Association of Manufacturers. And Mr. Peter Rogoff, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Sound Transit. And with that, I would ask unanimous consent that our witnesses' full statements be included in the record. And without objection, that is so ordered. And since your written testimony is going to be included in its entirety in the record, the committee would request that you limit your summary to 5 minutes. And with that, I will start with Mr. McKenna.
Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Norton, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to provide the perspective of the nation's state departments of transportation. My name is Patrick McKenna, and I serve as Director of the Missouri Department of Transportation. Today, it's my honor to testify on behalf of the great state of Missouri and AASHTO, which represents the transportation departments of all 50 states, Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico. As members of Congress and the President consider building a transportation infrastructure package, please consider the following. The future of the Federal Highway Trust Fund must be secured through long-term sustainable revenue solutions. Direct federal funding is needed instead of relying solely on incentives that encourage the use of private capital or borrowing. Wherever possible, traditional federal authorities should be assigned to states to expedite and streamline project delivery. Priority should be given to transportation investments that secure our nation's future for the long term instead of shovel-ready projects. And the existing federal program structure, including highways, transit, and rail, should be utilized. This would enable investments to flow to every region of the country. The FAST Act was the first long-term funding legislation since 2005. This allowed for funding certainty and planning. It also increased the amount of federal funds available that can be matched with state dollars. Prior to the FAST Act, there was federal funding instability, and Missouri was in the difficult position of considering abandoning maintenance on 26,000 out of 34,000 miles of roadways. Since the passage of the FAST Act, Missouri has taken on more financial risk as a state and increased our capital budget by $3 billion over 5 years. I want to thank Chairman Graves and members of this committee for your work to pass the FAST Act and to appeal for your continued action to create funding stability. The United States Department of Transportation notes in 2015 that state and local governments provided 80% of funds invested in highway and bridge programs and 74% of funds invested in transit programs. I cite these numbers because AASHTO and its members disagree with any notion that federal transportation funding displaces or discourages state and local investment. As my example of FAST Act funding stability shows, Missouri increased its budget alongside and as a result of federal investment. The Highway Trust Fund has provided stable, reliable, and substantial highway and transit funding for decades, but this is no longer the case. According to the Congressional Budget Office, annual Highway Trust Fund spending is estimated to exceed receipts by about $16 billion by 2021. Without your action, Missouri will be right back in the position we were prior to the FAST Act. Missouri could see a 40% reduction in funds, $400 million less for the state. Critical maintenance and improvements will stop. AASHTO believes that an infrastructure package must focus on direct grant funding rather than federal financing support. The state DOTs continue to support a role for financing and procurement tools such as public-private partnerships. We also maintain that financing instruments such as subsidized loans, tax-exempt municipal and private activity bonds, and infrastructure banks are insufficient to meet most types of transportation investment needs. Any new infrastructure plan should focus on the needs of rural America. Rural areas remain critical to the nation's economic success through the production and movement of goods such as agriculture and manufacturing products. AASHTO believes that we can improve program delivery by assigning some authorities traditionally assumed by the federal government to states that wish to participate, including federal funds obligation management, project agreements, and right-of-way acquisition, just to name a few. We ask Congress to consider establishing a project delivery pilot program. This program would develop innovative practices to streamline delivery and achieve positive environmental outcomes. Missouri has more than 1,000 miles of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. $12.5 billion in cargo travels up and down those waterways each year. We've seen firsthand how investments can pay long-term dividends. In the past 5 years, $13 million in state investment in ports has led to $53 million in investment from the private sector. Missouri's cost share program enables us to leverage contributions from local communities with state and federal funds to advance construction priorities. Since inception, $450 million in state participation has led to the delivery of more than $1 billion of construction projects. We urge Congress to build on the partnership that has flourished between the federal government and state DOTs. The flexibility to let state and local governments select projects based on public input allows local partners to work together to meet the unique needs of both urban and rural areas. Please take the necessary steps to ensure that all modes of transportation, rail, airports, transit, and ports, have access to additional federal resources that will keep our citizens connected and provide economic growth. I want to thank you again for the opportunity to testify today, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Mr. McKinnon. Mr. Roberts? Hit your button.
There we go. Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Holmes Norton, thank you for convening today's hearing. My name is Jim Roberts, and I am the President and Chief Executive Officer of Granite Construction Incorporated. We are a full-service infrastructure solutions provider performing as a general contractor, construction management firm, and construction materials producer. Headquartered in Watsonville, California, Granite teams are proud to have built American infrastructure across our great country since 1922. Across America, our work improves public safety, and it improves the efficiency of the gears of commerce. Whether represented in routine maintenance of Alaska or Arizona or California roadways, or represented by airport runway expansions, or even in the form of infrastructure projects of regional and national significance, such as the Tappan Zee Bridge replacement in New York, we are part of the communities in which we build. I am pleased to appear today on behalf of the Transportation Construction Coalition, or TCC. The TCC is a partnership of 31 national associations and construction unions. The full TCC roster is included in my written testimony. Some 60 years after the visionary investment in our interstate highway system that still supports our economy today, the country once again is ready to rally behind a bold federal infrastructure vision backed by a significant commitment to fund this vision. Taking the cue after decades of chronic federal inaction, more than half of the states in our country have increased funding commitments to their transportation programs in the past few years. Now is the perfect time for leadership to reemerge at the federal level. Mr. Chairman, let's begin with the Highway Trust Fund, which has a well-known permanent revenue shortfall that impedes the ability of state and local governments to plan, fund, and construct transportation projects. While the FAST Act was passed in 2015 and enacted last year, it is still not fully funded. If states follow past practices as expected, then some will start scaling back planned projects as early as 2019 due to federal funding uncertainty. The FAST Acts reformed the highway and public transportation programs in a manner that emphasized meeting national goals while providing states additional flexibility. The policy improvement was significant, but the funding commitment has paled in comparison. We encourage Congress to allocate and leverage the investment of any new resources among existing programs in a way that emphasizes big-ticket outcomes, such as improving our nation's economic competitiveness. The longer we wait to invest, the further we fall behind both the developed and, sadly, also the developing world in the safety, quality, and efficiency of our transportation, power, and water infrastructure. We strongly agree with the 253 members of the House of Representatives who have urged the Ways and Means Committee to include a Highway Trust Fund revenue fix in any tax reform legislation. Stabilizing the Highway Trust Fund and tax reform would provide a foundation and a platform for a broad-based, transformative infrastructure package. Increasing and indexing the federal motor fuels tax, which has lost nearly 70% of its purchasing power since 1993, is the simplest and most efficient short-term fix. However, given the pace of both mobility and technological change, we believe that all potential funding options should be on the table to create long-term solutions that stabilize and reinvigorate federal investments. Any Highway Trust Fund revenue construct must include permanently protected and dedicated revenue streams and resources sufficient to eliminate the shortfall and to support increased investment. While resources and structure are essential components, so too is ensuring the timely delivery of projects. In my written testimony, we suggested some practical reforms that begin with merging the National Environmental Policy Act and the Clean Water Act 404 permitting processes with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. We also believe a reasonable and measured approach to citizen suit reform is appropriate to mitigate today's all-too-common misuse of environmental laws. These reforms would ensure the promise of incremental infrastructure investment would be realized in a timely manner and not held up in red tape. Our society's decades-long underinvestment in infrastructure highlights and puts a human face on our very real need to improve America's infrastructure. Now is the time to act, as the work and the investment of previous generations is beginning to crumble right in front of our eyes. We look to you, our country's leaders, to guide and to promote the vision for critical overdue infrastructure investment in cities and in rural areas across America. Delayed maintenance and investment in transportation, water, and power systems continues to hamper the wellness of our country and decrease our global competitiveness. It is time to address infrastructure issues that have been ignored for decades. As inaction exacerbates our current state of disrepair nationally, I urge you all to take action and to be strong leaders, just like your predecessors from over 60 years ago, whose visionary actions we are still relying on today. Now is the time for our country's leadership to once again commit to real, long-term solutions. Mr. Chairman, thank you again for inviting the TCC to participate in today's discussion, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Roberts. Mr. Booker.
Good morning, Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Norton, and distinguished members of this subcommittee. My name is Brent Booker, Secretary-Treasurer of North America's Building Trades Unions. On behalf of the nearly 2 million skilled construction professionals that I am proud to represent across the United States, I'd like to thank you for allowing me to testify before this subcommittee. Building America's infrastructure is literally what our members do every day. Whether it's roads and bridges, airports, waterways, power plants and other energy infrastructure, municipal water systems, public buildings, or skyscrapers, our members apply their unique skill sets to building infrastructure in every corner of our great nation. For many of our members, the strength of the construction industry and the strength of their job opportunities is directly tied to the strength of public policy and advancing the building of public infrastructure. As such, I would like to thank the leadership of this subcommittee in helping move the most recent highway bill, the FAST Act. Highway bills are the single largest job-creating piece of legislation affecting our members, and they provide certainty to our members that opportunities will be available for years to come. While the FAST Act made important strides in improving our nation's surface transportation, I believe no one can argue that more can and must be done to further repair our nation's infrastructure. North America's Building Trades Unions believes a big, broad, bold infrastructure plan is a necessary step our country must take in order to solidify economic opportunities for workers and businesses across the United States. The question before this subcommittee and the Congress as a whole is, what should a plan include? For our members, a big infrastructure plan would reflect the overall investment level consistently reiterated by President Trump of $1 trillion. We believe such an investment will not only allow us as a nation to meet many of our pressing infrastructure needs, but will lay the foundation for sustained economic growth in communities large and small. In spurring this economic growth, a plan of this magnitude should, and I say must, increase the standard of living for Americans across the nation. In order to do so, the immense buying power of the federal government must not be used as leverage to depress wages in local communities, especially construction wages, which, adjusted for inflation, have actually been in decline since the late 1970s. Therefore, North America's Building Trades Unions members remain insistent that such a plan include the prevailing wage standards enshrined in the Davis-Bacon and related acts that our members have fought for over the course of generations. For our members, a broad infrastructure plan will encompass not only surface transportation infrastructure, but all modes of infrastructure, such as schools, municipal water systems, aviation, rail, waterways, broadband, and our energy infrastructure through new, modern power generation facilities, grid upgrades, and investments in energy transportation and distribution. To address the wide variety of infrastructure needs effectively, we must address them efficiently. In order to do so, we believe it prudent to address our challenges through currently existing programs. Efficiency should not breed duplicative programs designed to achieve the same goal. However, federal programs should be created to meet infrastructure needs that do not have existing public mechanisms to deliver projects. For our members, a bold infrastructure plan is one that tackles the tough challenges and lays out a vision for a brighter future. I would argue, and I'm sure most, if not all, of the members of the panel and the subcommittee would agree, that there's no greater challenge facing surface transportation than the long-term solvency of the Highway Trust Fund. We support a variety of measures to fix the trust fund and are open to a variety of proposals to ensure its solvency. We believe Congress should not squander such an important opportunity to address this issue. A bold infrastructure plan should also continue to tackle the challenge of major projects that have regional and national economic impacts. One such project is the roughly $4 billion Tappan Zee Bridge replacement in New York that to date is responsible for roughly 7 million hours of work, installing nearly 220 million pounds of U.S. steel and 300,000 cubic yards of concrete. While what those numbers do not tell you is that projects such as these, and in fact all public infrastructure projects, are critical to ensuring a consistent pipeline of skills training that North America's Building Trades Unions, in conjunction with our industry partners, provide through our privately funded registered apprenticeship programs. Spread out over our 1,600 formal joint labor management training centers across the country, as well as over 120 apprenticeship readiness programs, our unions and our contractor partners invest roughly $1.2 billion of our own capital into training our current and future members. Industry and labor, as well as community partners like the National Urban League and Youth Build, are working in partnership to meet the workforce challenges presented by a large investment in infrastructure. Former President Ronald Reagan once said, and I quote, "The bridges and highways we fail to repair today will have to be rebuilt tomorrow at many times the cost." He went on to say that rebuilding our infrastructure is simple common sense and that it represents an investment in tomorrow that we must make today. President Reagan was correct in his assessment over 30 years ago. Unfortunately, his words are just as prominent today due to continued inaction when it comes to substantive investment in our infrastructure. Continued inaction will only exacerbate our challenges and place unneeded negative pressures on the American economy. It's time once again for the infrastructure of the United States to be the envy of the world. The men and women of North America's building trades unions are ready, willing, and able and anxious to build it right and build it now so that the rebuilding of America begins as soon and as best as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Booker. Mr. McCarthy.
Good morning, Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Norton, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on such an important topic to Missourians and manufacturers across the nation. My name is Ray McCarty. I am President and CEO of Associated Industries of Missouri. We are Missouri's oldest business association, and our mission is to promote a favorable business climate for manufacturing and industry in Missouri. AIM is also the home of the Missouri Transportation and Development Council, which had its roots as the Good Roads Federation, which was formed, interestingly enough, by a guy named Harry B. Hawes, who went on to be elected to Congress and then to the U.S. Senate. We did pass that. That was to get Missouri out of the mud and build the first hard roads in Missouri. A very bold proposition for the early 1920s. But it's interesting that he also sponsored the bill that formed the Missouri Department of Transportation. We believe the transportation system in Missouri and across the nation demands continuing care and attention because it is vital to the state's economic welfare and quality of life. AIM is also the official state partner of the NAM, or the National Association of Manufacturers in Missouri. The NAM is the nation's largest industrial trade association and the unified voice for more than 12 million men and women who make things in America. Manufacturers appreciate your focus on building a 21st century infrastructure system because modern transportation and infrastructure systems are necessary to support modern manufacturing. We applaud your bipartisan work in 2015 to successfully reauthorize surface transportation programs for 5 years in the FAST Act. In October of 2016, the NAM released its infrastructure blueprint, Building to Win, and urged bipartisan action to revolutionize the infrastructure that makes the American dream possible. For too long, our nation has relied on the transportation, water, and energy infrastructure that we inherited from previous generations, as other speakers have alluded to, weakening our economy, threatening our communities, and putting the safety of our families at risk. For example, in Missouri, we rely on Interstate 70, the first highway to be built in the interstate system in 1956, along with several in other states. Interstate 70, along with Interstates 44 and 55, provide a critical conduit for raw materials and manufactured goods for manufacturers across the nation because of Missouri's location in the heart of America. As Ranking Member Norton suggested, congestion is a big problem. Already, traffic is increasing the cost of moving freight on our nation's highways by $63.4 billion per year. That's the equivalent, picture this, of 362,000 commercial truck drivers sitting idle for an entire work year. As modern manufacturing evolves and becomes even more productive, manufacturers rely on complex supply chains and just-in-time principles where parts are ordered, made, and delivered sometimes within hours. One large manufacturing company in Missouri recently lost an afternoon shift of production due to an accident on I-70 that closed that highway for just a couple of hours. The cost to that manufacturer was more than $1 million. Such delays can be devastating, especially for smaller manufacturers. Manufacturers also rely on transit to help get our employees to work. And if you think transit is limited to the urban areas, you must think again because we have organizations like OATS in Missouri that provide vital services to rural Americans. There's no excuse for delay. Manufacturers believe the nation must undertake an infrastructure effort that seeks to modernize our aging systems and makes a long-term public commitment to infrastructure. Manufacturers believe federal leadership and funding are needed to address bottlenecks in both rural and metropolitan areas that will improve the system-wide movement of freight throughout this country. Addressing the long-term solvency of the Highway Trust Fund should be a pillar of a 21st century infrastructure proposal. The NAM urges Congress to shore up the fund with a reliable, user-based, long-term funding stream. In 2015, the average cost of congestion cost per truck vehicle mile traveled was 23 cents. That was up 25% of what it was in 2014. This is really a hidden tax, but it's not a tax that we can invest. It's just being wasted. It's being wasted on idle labor hours and unnecessary vehicle wear and tear, and instead of being invested in the Highway Trust Fund to help build a 21st century infrastructure system to improve America's economic competitiveness. Manufacturers need federal policymakers to preserve and grow the funding and financing tools for states and localities. Tax-exempt municipal bonds should be protected as policymakers consider ways to expand the funding and financing toolbox with public-private partnerships and leveraging opportunities. Also, Good governance improvements to better deliver 21st century infrastructure, such as expedited environmental reviews, are critical to the success of any effort. For decades, this committee has modeled bipartisan governance that puts solutions and progress before politics. That bipartisan leadership is needed now more than ever to deliver a pro-manufacturing infrastructure package that will include a vision for modern 21st century infrastructure. This is the right opportunity to address neglected projects that make a system-wide difference and improve manufacturers' supply chains, as well as develop long-term solutions to chronic funding issues in infrastructure programs such as the Highway Trust Fund. And I'll be happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Mr. McCarty. Mr. Rogoff.
Thank you, Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Norton, Chairman Schuster, Ranking Member DeFazio. While I've appeared before this subcommittee in the past in other roles, I'm particularly pleased to join you today to bring the perspective from one of the nation's fastest growing regions. In his first address before Congress, President Trump declared, and I quote, "Crumbling infrastructure will be replaced with new roads, bridges, tunnels, airports, and railways gleaming across our very, very beautiful land." And we at Sound Transit, like rail transit agencies across the nation, are prepared to deliver on the President's vision for gleaming railways. While we are encouraged by the President's goals for infrastructure, we have been deeply disappointed by budget proposals from his administration that appear to undermine those goals. At the same time, administration officials have made other statements regarding the infrastructure initiatives that we can applaud and endorse, including the value of overmatching federal funds, the value of an expanded TIFIA program, and the importance of training a skilled workforce. It's clear that this committee will be key to driving this effort, and as such, I would offer the following recommendations. First, I would echo what the other witnesses have already said in arguing that funding in a new infrastructure initiative must not substitute for base-level funding authorized through the FAST Act and provided in annual appropriations acts. This is critical for rail transit agencies who must expand to meet population growth. Under the administration's budget request for 2018, the funding level sought for major new transit expansions is effectively zero, ignoring the authorizations you put in the FAST Act. At Sound Transit, we have been working with the FTA for years to secure grant agreements for two extensions of our light rail spine, one running north from Seattle to the city of Linwood, the other running south to the city of Federal Way. We are joined by many similar projects around the country that seek to meet expanded demand with a strong, reliable federal partner. Regrettably, the administration's proposal to terminate that partnership attempts to rekindle a decades-old ideological debate over the value of transit projects to our national mobility. Smartly, states and municipalities across the political spectrum have long since moved beyond that old ideological debate. We were altogether heartened to see bipartisan and bicameral congressional support for rejecting the administration's proposed funding cuts for transit expansions for fiscal 2017 and are hopeful for a similar outcome this year. Second, any new infrastructure plan must include transit expansion funding in major metro areas. The most recent census tells us that our population and economy will be increasingly urban. I won't repeat the data that Ms. Norton cited in terms of the 70 million more Americans that will be overwhelmingly located in urban areas, but in the Puget Sound region, congestion has nearly doubled in just the last 5 years, and we are expecting 1 million more citizens by 2040. Without new mobility options, this growth threatens to choke off our own continued prosperity. Our major urban megaregions will increasingly serve as an economic engine, and I would use the example of Amazon's recent announcement that while continuing to expand in Seattle, they are looking to open a second national headquarters. It's not an accident that Amazon is insisting that all cities bidding on their second headquarters provide detailed data on the availability of direct access to rail transit services. It is one of just 4 identified site requirements in their RFP. These are the infrastructure requirements for a 21st century economy. Third, we do believe the administration may be on the right track in highlighting the importance of states and localities providing robust matching funds to access new federal dollars above the base level of funding. The federal share of Sound Transit's voter-approved capital plan is just 16%, and we have already taken 2 major light rail expansion projects with 0 FTA capital investment grant dollars. The taxpayers of Washington State have demonstrated remarkable levels of self-help to meet their surface transportation needs. The ballot measure that we passed just this past November called on the median voter to increase their own taxes by $169 a year, every year, to expand our mass transit network. The same legislation that let us go to the voters also increased the state's gas tax by 11.9 cents, bringing us to the second highest gas tax in the nation. The point is, we are doing a remarkable level of self-help to meet our surface transportation needs, but any federal infrastructure policy should reward this level of local effort, not penalize it, as is proposed in the administration's proposed budget. Lastly, I would just say that we are very supportive of efforts to streamline the federal environmental process. Transit projects are inherently environmentally beneficial, but these efforts must be done with great respect for the core environmental protections in federal law. In the Pacific Northwest, the economic health of the region and our quality of life go hand in hand with the protection of our environment. Streamlining the environmental review process should not mean short-circuiting the process. Federal agencies will do us no favor if hastily produced environmental documents give project opponents an opening to delay our projects in the courts. And in that regard, we need to remember that litigants in this space often don't care one whit for the environment. Instead, they try to use the environmental process to slow or kill a project because it is their last best chance to thwarting the will of the voters or reversing the plans of a state or a local government. This is not limited to transit projects or highway projects or water projects. It's the way the process works. So I would just summarize by encouraging this committee to take care as we do environmentally streamlining. There is further progress that can be made, but please also look at the staffing levels at the agencies, the natural resource agencies, and at DOT to make sure that there is staff on hand to produce quality environmental documents so our projects are not stopped in the courts. Thanks very much.
Thank you all. We're now going to recognize each member for 5 minutes for questions, and I'm going to start with Mr. Schuster, followed by Mr. DeFazio.
Thank you, Chairman Graves. As I said in the opening statement, I think one of the key components is we have to figure out a long-term funding stream. I know my colleague, Mr. DeFazio, was very passionate about that, as am I. He's come up with a funding plan that seems reasonable to me. There's probably, I don't know, 10 or a dozen of them out there. And when you come up with a new plan to try to educate members of Congress on it, it's very, very difficult. I'm trying to do that on a bill right now with an FAA bill that I have some members that don't seem to understand what I'm trying to do. But again, when you're moving forward with a funding stream, long-term sustainable, let's keep it simple. We have one in place now. We ought to be looking at that one very closely before we start going off on different new ideas because it's very efficient. The math is pretty simple and straightforward, but I'm open to everything, and that has to be a priority for me on how do we fund this so, as I said earlier, we don't kick the can down the road. But I think we also have to be thinking outside the box, ways to bring dollars in. Public-private partnerships are not a silver bullet. Let me say that again. Public-private partnerships aren't a silver bullet, but it's a hell of a good tool to have in the tool bag. And there's some new ones out there that we ought to be looking at. And I'm going to ask the question about asset recycling. And my colleagues, some of my colleagues on the other side say, you want to sell all our assets. You don't, if you look at the Australian model, what they did, they hardly sold any assets. They leased them. Leasing is far different than selling. Leasing is you still retain the ownership of it. You allow somebody to come in, turn that asset into cash over time, and the idea is to have a bonus payment to do that. And again, the Australian model, we met with Ambassador Hockey now, the former, or the architect of this program in Australia. And the first question of a group of Republicans was, the Chinese are going to buy all our assets. And the Australians said, no, they didn't. We wouldn't let them. Now, they're investors, but they don't control them. They're not on the boards. So again, it's money, and money is around the world that's out there. There's trillions of dollars that money would love to invest in America's infrastructure projects, and they're not looking for a 8 and 10% return if you're doing a 30 or 40 year deal. They're good with 3 and 3.5%. Some of these pension funds, even our own unions in this country are looking at that. I was talking to a building trades union the other day, and they're investing their money in Canadian infrastructure. It's heresy, isn't it? Building trades, investing in a foreign country? No, they're doing it because it's making money for the folks that they're responsible for their pension. So I think asset recycling is something we ought to consider. We ought to look at what the Australians have done with it, and to all accounts, they've generated over $20 billion in just a very short period of time on top of what they spend. So again, I would ask Mr. McKenna and Mr. Roberts and Mr. Booker to respond to that first. Just your thoughts, if you're even familiar with asset recycling and what you think the prospects are.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, and in fact, the way we look at this is you really have to look at these things on a project-by-project basis. You have to look at the benefit to the taxpayers, the cost of capital, and do the analysis on a complicated project to determine if advancing the construction on that particular facility is not available through other means, what's the benefit to the taxpayers in terms of reduction in congestion, enhanced facilities. The recycling has been done at a number of airports. We're looking at it in Missouri at a couple airports as well. And then make sure that you're playing out those costs and benefits. Like you said, it's a tool in the toolbox. And I think that's appropriate for us to have all the tools we can. This is a large problem we have to solve all over the country, and we need all the tools we can to do so.
Mr. Roberts?
Just briefly, we've been involved in a few projects where we are actually handling the financing mechanisms of them. I would suggest that they should not be considered just a short-term issue. We need to look at the long-term also, and I think that some of the times when we monetize some assets from a short-term benefit, we also pay a bigger bill in the long term. So what I've seen both in the private sector and the public sector, long-term DCF models, financial models are imperative, but knowing what you're getting rid of before you get rid of it, I think, is the imperative number here. But privatization and the 3P program is absolutely another tool in the tool chest for all of our individual DOTs and agencies in the country.
And not to be repetitive, however, I would look at it, and lump asset recycling along with PPPs. They're not all created equal, and there are some really good public-private partnerships out there that are doing really good things out there. There's some that aren't so good, and I think when you look at the asset recycling program based on what the project is, what the long-term gain is, and you're right, talking about our pension dollars. We invest our pension dollars in projects that make sense. Our first goal is to put our members to work. And you also have the fiducial responsibility of a trustee on a pension fund to make sure that you're getting the returns that are comparative to the market. So when those things add up and those things match up, we would be in support of them. But you would almost have to take a look at it case by case to see what the investment strategy is and what the standards are for the workers that are going to be doing that construction.
Well, I thank you. I appreciate that answer, and I agree. We got to look at case by case, but there are some things out there that could be absolute home runs and some we walk away from. I know I've gone over my time, Mr. Chairman. If you indulge me for one more second. The only reason I didn't include Mr. Rogoff because I knew I was going to run out of time, but if you could, in writing at some point, give us your views on it, or in 10 seconds, if you could just sort of give us a...
transit has the challenge of having excess revenues to actually entice an investor. Colorado has done it through availability payments. We ourselves, being financially strong, are looking about whether it makes sense for us. I think the important point is really the one you made at the beginning. Right. It should be a tool in the tool chest. It shouldn't have a leg up on everything else.
Right, absolutely. And just one final point, Mr. Chairman, if you'll indulge me. The state of Connecticut, I don't know if there's any state bluer in the country than Connecticut. And I don't know if Ms. Estes knows this. She's probably aware of it. Several years ago, they had all the roadside plazas, travel plazas on the interstate were owned by the state of Connecticut. According to all reports, they were run down. Service was terrible. They leased them to the Carlyle Group several years ago. The Carlyle Group came in, refurbished them all. They put competition, so, McDonald's versus Burger King's bidding to get Starbucks versus Dunkin' Donuts. And now, by all accounts, I'm told they're gleaming, beautiful travel plazas with great service, and they're paying the state of Connecticut money back into the coffers instead of it going the other way. So it can be done, has been done. That's probably a fairly small scale, but in a state like if Connecticut can do it, my goodness. Texas can do it, and Pennsylvania, I hope, will do it. But again, thank you all very much.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. We did have a special select committee of members here appointed by the chairman 4 years ago. We met for more than a year, heard from many people in a real hearing and interchange format about P3s, and we put out a bipartisan consensus report. And the conclusion was that if you look at America's broad infrastructure needs, P3s with the best facilitation through law can deal with somewhere between 10 and 12% of our infrastructure needs. So that still leaves a hell of a lot on the table, 88 to 90%. So yes, P3s, fine. Well-regulated P3s, great. But that's not a solution. And it's not even the major tool in the toolbox, and it can't be. There's a really interesting new statistic, which is that the toll rate per mile for a P3 toll road is 30 cents. And the rate for a non-P3 toll road is 14 cents. That does raise some questions about what we're going to do to the American driving public and the trucking industry if we're going to go principally down the P3 route. So these things need to be discussed thoroughly. Also, what we found in doing that report was that almost every large P3 out there is substantially funded by the federal government. They all use TIFIA for 80 to 90% of their needs. So yeah, the private capital puts up 10, 15%, and then they turn to the federal government. So I think it points to the absolute essential need for us to have a robust long-term spending stream, and one that delivers things to the American public at the least cost. And direct federal partnership with the states is the way to do that. And just to comment on the salesman down at the Australian embassy who I met with, yeah, they did it for 2 years. It was such a grand success, they did it for 2 years. And most of the money went to two of their provinces. And one was New South Wales, who had been selling things off for years on their own. And then they got an extra bonus payment from the federal government to do yet another sale of assets that they'd already been doing. So here, if we follow that model, we'll take gas tax dollars, which don't exist and are already in short supply, and we will go to local jurisdictions who already have the authority, if they so wish, to sell off their ports or their airports or whatever they want to do. That's up to the local jurisdiction. The federal government doesn't need to bribe them with dollars that we don't have to do that. It was a dumb idea in Australia. The new government came in. They said, hey, we're done with that. Put all the remaining money back into the national program and directly distributes it back out across the country. So it didn't work there. It's not going to work here. And we just shouldn't get on that false path. So, Mr. McKenna, I agree with everything you said. Has your organization presented these ideas to this administration?
We have been participating with roundtable discussions that have occurred. We certainly support, and AASHTO supports a robust discussion on the baseline funding. But we also understand that we have to have flexibility in the program as well. And state DOTs are recognizing the fact that we have to look at procurement methods that maybe are not just the simple procurement methods of the past, that we have to open ourselves up in the case of particular projects that are very complicated and very difficult to structure financially. We're looking at those possibilities, design build finance, those types of things. Those are good, and they actually help us work even closer with our construction partners to bring innovative solutions to the engineering problems that we face. So it's a combination itself. It's not a one-size-fits-all, but DOTs have to open up to our own approach as well, because that's part of the solution also.
No, I totally agree with you on that, and the federal government should facilitate that, not hobble them by prescriptive means with attached dollars. But you would still say that a robust additional federal investment is still critical to most states.
Yes.
All right. And one other quick question, I realized, but Chairman went over 2 minutes, so I'll take a little attitude. Would be 24 states have already raised their gas tax or raised funds in one way or another. And yet, you know, the administration is talking about providing incentives to states that raise their revenues in the future. I think, and if you have ideas on this, I mean, some states have already gone up to the bar, taken the risk. I would say that if we are going to provide an incentive, it should have a look-back provision. Would anybody disagree with that and look back through, you know, because these states already did what was right, and then they could, if they want to do yet even more, they could get more incentive, but there should be some sort of a look-back and not reward the 26 states who haven't done a damn thing. Anybody disagree with that?
I would just add one other option, Mr. DeFazio. There has been legislated in the past level of effort requirements. So that doesn't necessarily look back a set period of time, but sees what a state or a municipality has done over a longer, historically. But it does take a look at the self-sacrifice they've already made before they come to the federal well, and that would certainly make sense.
Could you provide some information on that, or do you?
It was
my staff probably.
It was a Byrd amendment in iced tea. I'll have to go dig it out, but yes, sir.
Okay, great. Anybody else have a comment on that? Mr. Roberts?
Well, I just make a quick comment on your opening statement as well. I want to thank you for your passion on the subject, and I can't agree with what you said in your opening statement any more so. That this is, and I think that Ms. Norton mentioned the same thing, this is a network system. This is a federal issue. And there are a lot of tools in the tool chest, but the federal issue and the federal funding is the single most important portion of this. The alternative procurement methods can get more efficiencies in how we procure the work. We've got construction manager, general contractor associations today. We've got at-risk jobs. We've got 3Ps. We've got design, build, finance. Those alternatives are great, but I think you hit the nail on the head relative to the primary force today is that we need additional funding from the federal government to get all those programs enacted. I want to thank you for your passion.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Roberts. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. DeFazio. I yield my time to Mr. Schuster.
Well, thank you, Chairman. I won't take it all up. 4 points, very important points. One, Mr. Roberts and Mr. DeFazio, I agree with you. For more federal dollars, we've got to figure this out. That's the #1 priority. But we got to look at other ways also to try to beef that up. And 3 points on the Australian example. #1, it was a 2-year program. So it did end in 2 years because they wanted to force the issue to say if you want in this program, you got to get into it quick, and that's what it did. So it did end in 2 years. New South Wales opposed this program in Parliament to the bitter end, and when it was passed, they were the first ones in line to get this based on a first-come, first-served basis. So if now they tell me if you go to New South Wales, they're boring 4 tunnels under the harbor. They got more high-rise cranes than any other country in any city in the world. So again, South Wales opposed it. New South Wales opposed it until it became the policy, and then they were there front and center. And finally, public entities like our airports in this country, our water systems, do not pay local, state, and federal taxes. When a private company comes on board and starts to run it, they pay local, state, and federal taxes. That's the way the funding mechanism was done in Australia. They based it on the revenue they would generate by this entity taking it over and what they would begin to pay in federal taxes. So, once again, if we just shut the door on something like this without taking a good hard look, I think that we're kidding ourselves. We've got to figure out a funding stream that's sustainable, that's long-term, but also look at these other tools in the toolbox. And if we can take this 3P tool from 10 to 12% and turn it into 15 to 18%, I think that's a pretty good day's work. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My questions are going to center on rural America and the needs, and they're also going to concentrate on long-term solvency of the trust fund, but I'll wait to the end of the hearing if they haven't been answered by then, and I'll turn to Ms. Norton for her questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Schuster floated what could be called a new idea, relatively new idea. If you think about our transportation network, it has suffered from having relatively few new ideas. And all of this time that we've had this network, we have, until recently when we didn't do very much until we were able to pass the long-term bill in 2015, we've been running on the same grid. So I am interested in what the answer to Chairman Schuster's question about exploring new ideas, because it's a very different country that may, where something in the toolbox may work someplace and something not. But Mr. Rogoff, you really made me think about this notion of overmatching or self-help. You would think, particularly with my colleagues on the other side being in charge, you'd want to incentivize that. Out of desperation, of course, we have seen with the gas tax, people just step up without the federal match. But you describe what some would call overmatching, because you've gone back to your taxpayers not only for the gas tax, but for your infrastructure generally. And you are concerned that the administration which says it wants to reward such states and regions, is in fact cut. You know, in this region, for example, in the District of Columbia, we wanted desperately to have a subway stop, which now the New York Avenue subway stop. Well, because it would help develop an entire area of the District of Columbia, it was funded by business, by the District of Columbia, and by the administration, not any federal transportation funds. It may be it may be one of a kind in the country. But this notion of incentivizing rather than de-incentivizing is of great interest to me, particularly given the dearth of new ideas. Now, I don't want to do anything, and I think on both sides you've heard people say the federal dollars, you begin there. But I wonder if you have given any thought to how to encourage more jurisdictions like the Sound Transit to overmatch or to move ahead on infrastructure while being assured that it wouldn't be punished by the federal government. Now, I'm looking for an incentive because apparently you have done it, perhaps because there was no other way to do it. I'm looking for a positive way to encourage people who want to invest in their own local infrastructure or transit for their own local reasons to, in fact, receive some award or let's call it encouragement, some incentive from the federal government. Mr. Rogoff, have you given any thought to that? Because it's you who put the thought in my head in the first place.
Well, thank you, Ms. Norton. I have given it some thought, and it's been talked about in the past, and that is, you know, when you talk about these major transit expansions, we should first recognize that unlike the classic 80-20 split of an 80% federal investment to a 20% local investment, by law we are capped at 50%. For the projects that we're seeking assistance for from the FTA right now, we're looking for 40% federal funding to get to Linwood and just 25% funding to get to Federal Way. So these are efforts we're making because we are determined to get there, and the region, the congestion being what it is, needs it very badly.
So, I mean, are you saying, for example, if you wanted to do something new, perhaps take less of a federal match?
Well, we're being backed into that approach, I think, in part by federal budget policy. When I talk about being penalized for overmatching, there was a specific write-up that came out of OMB when the president's budget came forward that called out by name the Puget Sound area, Los Angeles, and Denver, and pointed out as a rationale to eliminate the federal partnership the fact that we had gone to our voters and raised our own taxes for transit expansions.
Now, this is what I mean, Mr. Chairman. You know, if you want to encourage what Puget Sound, what Sound Transit did elsewhere, then we ought to be, and I'm very interested in discussion with you, how can we use that rather than punish that at a time when it's so difficult to get funding? I did want to ask Mr. McKenna a question because he represents the whole state of Missouri, and he spoke about the immediate crisis in rural areas. I couldn't agree more. If we're having trouble in what is a relatively wealthy area in this region, I can't imagine what if we go into Southern Virginia, for example. They must be going through. But you represent an entire state. And while you called attention to the immediate crisis in rural areas, I wonder what you'd say about cities like St. Louis or Kansas City that have pressing needs at the same time. What I'm trying to get to, Mr. McKenna, is what this committee has always avoided, and that is pitting one part of the region against another part, going back to the Eisenhower administration, the recognition that this was one vast network. So I am the first to acknowledge the immediate crisis. I don't see how rural areas are able to do anything. I wonder how you bring together, you who represent the entire state, big cities like St. Louis and Kansas City, with places that can't possibly fund any of their transportation or very few of their transportation needs, like your rural roads.
Well, the gentlelady would yield just a second, too. I'd like to add to that just the insurance of those, rural areas across the country. How do we ensure that they aren't left out in this process?
Yes.
Well, thank you for the question. In Missouri, what we do is we allocate the limited resources that we have based on objective criteria. It's similar to the allocation that's done by Congress with the Surface Transportation Bill, and that's why we think that's so important. When we look at our rural areas, for instance, we're just now undertaking a replacement of the Champ Clark Bridge, which connects parts of rural Missouri with Illinois. Had we not had that underway, our rural communities would have a 77-mile detour if that bridge went down. It was built originally in 1928. But likewise, we have structures in St. Louis and Kansas City that carry 120,000 cars a day. So it all comes down to dollars and cents and how you allocate those, I think. An objective criteria for allocating resources is critical so that neither area feels that they've been disadvantaged over the other. We use population, we use employment data, we use size of the infrastructure, vehicle miles traveled, and square footage of bridge deck to allocate capital resources among the regions. So the urban areas receive a larger share of the pie, but they should. And the rural areas receive their relative share. What happens is it's very difficult to move the needle on large projects like a major river crossing. This is a $60 million enterprise for us. And we do have to build up resources over years to subsidize that area to be able to make that, because your point is taken that this entire system is connected. And if we let any of those connections go down, we're disconnecting the communities themselves. So it's the allocation of resources objectively, I think, is an antidote to that, but recognizing that there's not enough money coming into the top line to satisfy all the needs in any of the regions is really critical.
Mr. Schuster, and finally, Chairman Schuster made a very important point. And it perhaps wasn't beneficial to where he represents. And he said that rural areas pay more in gas tax. But then he pointed out what they get back in overfunding. And again, if we lose that notion, that you don't ultimately lose by the funding of a network of transportation and infrastructure, then we've lost the great American transportation lesson. I thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Gibbs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First question may go to Mr. McKenna or Mr. McCartney. We made a lot of progress, I think, in the FAST Act, encouraging intermodal transportation through the National Highway Freight Program and other initiatives. How can we improve on that and in an infrastructure package? Do you see that freight program working, and what kind of improvements? Go ahead, Mr. Marker.
Thank you for the question, and we appreciate that. From the manufacturer's standpoint, we're not safety experts, and we need someone to be able to tell us reliable safety scores. We have right now manufacturing members of the National Association of Manufacturers who were ordered to trial by judge after they hired a twice satisfactory rated motor carrier because the judge was confused whether the data presented by the plaintiff or the two satisfactory safety ratings indicated that the motor carrier had been deemed safe to operate on the nation's highways by the FMC.
I think you're answering my second question I was going to ask.
Okay.
My first question was about the freight program.
Yes. If I might, thank you for the question, Representative. We feel that the freight program is actually focusing our efforts as a state, and it's doing so reasonably. We think that the provisions of both MAP 21 and the FAST Act that encouraged every state to put together a freight plan and to work with their local partners to do so as a baseline for further investment was important. We did so in Missouri in 2014, and we're actually using that as the baseline for a lot of our primary cost benefit on our construction projects that we're looking at. We know that a secondary benefit will occur when we remove these freight bottlenecks to encourage commerce. There'll be a passenger benefit as well. And a safety benefit on top of that. So I think it is working, and I think that remaining to have that focus is important.
Yeah. Mr. McCartney, before I get to my second question, I was going to ask you, my first one is, you mentioned in your testimony about the importance of municipal bond, tax-exempt bonds, and I don't think that's in our framework right now, but do you want to elaborate on why is that so important?
Sure. As tax reform is being considered, we think it's very important that we preserve the ability to deduct the interest from those municipal bonds, because it preserves another funding measure that can be used to generate funds that we need to fix the roads. These municipal bonds right now, if you take away the tax deductibility of them, that can make them less attractive. And so we'd like to make sure that they're considered as you go forward. It's not something that is just a positive to the balance sheet. It's something that could act as an incentive to maintain that tax deductibility and generate more investment.
And my question, I think you were starting to answer before, dealing with the, you mentioned in your testimony about one hiring standard for trucking companies.
Yes.
And, you know, in the FAST Act, we mandated a review of the CSA, the Compliance, Safety, and Accountability Program. And then also, do you have any comments on that and the recommendations from the National Academies?
Yes, as I've started to say before, the CSA, you know, we think safety scores are important, but they're not something that manufacturers can come up with and can be expected. We're manufacturers, we're not motor carriers. So we do rely on the FMCSA to regulate motor carrier safety. Putting manufacturers in the middle of that leads to unhappy consequences for the manufacturers that can get caught in lawsuits. Currently, there's no requirement for manufacturers to check any of those qualifications when they hire a motor carrier. So if we established a national hiring standard or something that would provide some protection to those manufacturers as they hire their motor carriers, we think that would be something to consider.
Yeah, I just have problems with the way it was set up in 2010, the CSA, and it dings our truckers unfairly, and then you know, for the insurance rates, and then also when carriers like customers like the manufacturers are looking at the truckers or the trucking companies, they're unfairly treated, and that doesn't give a real snapshot of what's really going on, and they get penalized unfairly. And so hopefully we can get that fixed. So I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Esty.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd like to note and thank some of my colleagues here that we have launched a bipartisan Congressional Infrastructure Caucus, and that includes Mr. Graves and Mr. Duncan and John Patrick Maloney. So we'll be working to get our colleagues from all different committees, not just this committee, because as we've been discussing here today, the revenue aspects are incredibly important. That involves Ways and Means, and energy and commerce as well, as we look at how technology is rapidly changing the needs and demands. So I wanted to let you know that and urge any of my colleagues who are not yet members, sign up today. We are facing, okay, so Mr. DeFazio is starting the bidding, thank you. We're being outcompeted by China and other countries that are robustly investing in their infrastructure, and we don't have 20 or 40 years to wait to get on with it. Mr. McCarty, you encapsulated the remarks of many of the manufacturers in my district who are looking at us and saying, how can I possibly compete when I can't get my goods to market and I can't even get my workers here to the factory? That's the #1 complaint in my state of Connecticut, is actually transportation, more than taxes, more than anything else. And so this problem has been brewing for decades. Everybody here has mentioned it. We need revenue. We need revenue when you can do financing, and I think a lot of us are open to creative ways of financing, but we have a serious revenue problem. We've relied historically on user fees. The world is changing. Cars are more efficient. We didn't index the gas tax. We're having alternative fuels. A number of members of Congress here drive vehicles that don't pay any gas tax whatsoever. So we need to look down the road. My kids never take cars. They use a card-sharing service. We're looking at autonomous vehicles. So I'd like all of you to help with us think about how are we going to look at those aspects? How are we going to be evaluating projects based on future infrastructure needs when we have such rapidly changing technology, rapidly changing usage patterns, increasing urbanization, which Mr. Rogoff talked about. We're going to be needing to do a lot more transit if you look at the demographic patterns. So that's happening very fast, and we're going to need your help in thinking that through. So that's one question. Another one is on the P3s. One of the concerns I have, and I think they need to be part of the mix, but that prioritizes making revenue not necessarily what is in the public's interest in meeting those needs. So it meets certain kinds of projects. It may be very smart for something like high-speed rail in the Northeast, where you know their actual high-speed rail would have a revenue stream and you need massive investment. Maybe that works. For a lot of things, it doesn't. I'd love to hear your thoughts on life cycle costs and fix it first. A lot of my concern, again, with the creative financing mechanisms are they tend not to deal with actually fixing current infrastructure. It prioritizes something that can create a new revenue stream. And living in an older part of infrastructure in the Northeast, you know, we're concerned. And I do want to point out my state is one of those states that has continued to raise the gas tax. And yet, some of the proposals on the table, and Mr. Lipinski and Mr. Davis and I were at the White House 2 weeks ago, and they are talking about incentivizing states to step up. Well, my state's been stepping up for some time now. So I think it's really important that we not punish states who have already taken those steps to reward ones that have not. So just a few questions, and anyone who wants to get started, thank you.
Well, I might quickly take a question on life cycle cost, because as you pointed out, especially in the Northeast and areas like Connecticut, you've got systems like Metro North and others that have been deteriorated over time with age and have struggled to recapitalize and rebuild what they've got. I think it is right for this committee in crafting a new initiative to, whether it's highways, transit, water, or anyone, to ask project sponsors to identify and evaluate the merits of their proposals based on not just their ability to build it, but they're having the revenue streams to maintain it. It's something we started at the Federal Transit Administration when I was there, and that is at least, the question was, if we're going to invest in expanding your footprint, shouldn't we at least know how you're doing in maintaining your current footprint? We have a mechanism in Sound Transit. In our ballot measures, the voters adopt a capital plan and they adopt increased taxes. The taxes are then rolled back to the level necessary to operate and maintain it. So we have a revenue stream for maintenance. A great many other systems don't. We're now paying the price for that. And it's certainly a question, whether it's highways or transit or water, people should be asking.
And if I may just answer on the fix it first, or I mean, we certainly are proponents of new construction, and certainly feel that there's an unbelievable need in this country for new rail, new water, new bridge, new roads and highways. Take a look at the American Society of Civil Engineers' most recent report of where we currently stand with our current infrastructure of a graded D+. We have over 50,000 structurally deficient bridges that our citizens are driving across every day. So as we try to develop these new revenue streams to build new construction, we have to focus on what is currently deficient in our country today. Many bridges and tunnels that are decades old, 50, 60, 70 years old, that we're putting ourselves and our fellow citizens at risk every day by them driving over those bridges, by them driving through those tunnels, by getting on that Amtrak train and riding on rail that is deficient. So we have to come up with a way to fix our existing system as we also continue to meet the challenges of today's society of the growing needs of what we have.
And if I might, with regard to looking at the entire capital plan, I think we have to look at this whole bill really like a company would look at an investment portfolio. There's not a particular solution that's going to meet the needs of every region of the country uniformly. From a standpoint of AASHTO and from a standpoint of a state DOT, the flexibility, opening up the flexibility of the surface transportation so that states can meet their local needs. We have a planning framework that we go through utilizing metropolitan planning organizations and regional planning commissions that the needs of those communities, they know best what their needs are, whether it's new construction, expansion for capacity, or fixing the existing system. And the flexibility to utilize the federal funds in concert with those local needs, I think, is a critical aspect.
I would just add one more comment, if I could. The maintenance issue has gotten so big in this country that when you look alone in the state of California, $140 billion of backlog maintenance to get the system, both the interstate system and the actual local systems up to grade, that is almost has to be a priority. We cannot be isolating funds just for expansion when we haven't taken care of what we have already. And I would suggest that a lot of the states today are focusing on that because they understand that that backlog has gotten so immense that if they don't take care of it, the cost basis goes up exponentially if they don't take care of it to begin with. So I would commend the legislature in California for putting together a $50 billion program to mostly focus on getting that entire infrastructure transportation system up to speed so that they can move forward from this point on. So the backlog and the long-term versus the short-term, we've got to take care of the short-term, otherwise we won't have a long-term.
Mr. Davis.
Hey, Mr. Chairman, can I ask for a point of personal privilege real quick before I get started? I would like T&I committee to welcome back my good friend who just snuck in the back room. It looks like he's back at work right now, but Matt Micah. Stand up, Matt. He's recovering well from the tragedy he experienced a few months ago. Welcome back, my friend. Hey, quick question for everybody on the panel. Raise your hand if you think that we can stabilize and solidify the Highway Trust Fund by just raising the gas tax. Oh, you guys have listened well to the people behind you because they usually get asked the same question by us. And that's what's great about this hearing because we're actually finally talking about diversification. You know, it's Peter DeFazio's rage over the fact that we haven't addressed many issues that we listened to a few minutes ago, well, a long few minutes ago now. And Schuster talking about, I think, is part of that diversification, asset recycling, P3s. The discussion here is very bipartisan. The discussion that Ms. Esty and Mr. Lipinski and a few of us others had at the White House the other morning was centered on infrastructure and how do we be able to, how do we solidify and how do we stabilize our infrastructure dollars? Everybody's got a lot of ideas. Why can't we use them all? Now, diversification is something I've been talking about since I got here 4.5 years ago. How do we diversify? What do we do to make sure that we're ready for the next generation of vehicles? I think we all agree, because none of you raised your hand, that the gas tax is the only answer, that how on one hand can we have our Highway Trust Fund funded by one source that the same federal government, all of us that are participants in, how do we tell you to burn less of it? I think what should scare everybody sitting at that table and everybody here is that we've got countries like France that say in the next 20 years they don't want a single gasoline-powered vehicle on their roadway. Let's say President Macron is half right. What does that mean for the percentage of electric vehicles that are on our roadways? And what are we going to be able to do to actually have a trust fund? Imagine when electric technology gets into the fleet level. What will that do besides decimate our Highway Trust Fund? So our job is to plan. And we can sit and we can talk about putting these ideas together. We can talk about diversification. But in the end, we actually got to come up with a plan that's going to get votes. And all sides are going to have to sit down instead of just discuss solutions like we're doing today. What's going to get us to an actual bill that's going to pass? And that's where we need your help. Because we all agree something has to be done. But the funny thing about Washington is those details are the things that kind of stick us up. Now, you all agree that we need diversification. Who wants to be the first one to tell me what plan is going to work best? Anybody? Mr. McKenna. Thank you for talking about rural Illinois, too. Great place.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, again, when we talk about diversification, I think we have to recognize that as fuel efficiency increases, the revenue will decrease in the gas tax. I'd like to point out something that...
Because the federal government's telling manufacturers to create engines that burn less. Well,
and I'd like to point out something that's going on in the state of Georgia right now. In 2015, one of the AASHTO members actually put an inflator onto their gas tax. They raised their gas tax as a baseline. Then they put an inflator on that, in part, used the fuel economy of the entire Georgia vehicle fleet. So that just kicked in this past year. It created an adjustment so that they didn't lose any money into their own revenue based on the rising fuel economy. So we're going to have to look for things that create some way to adjust through to the new future, but not to forget the baseline of what the funding is that will get us there.
Okay, Mr. Rogoff, I didn't see your hand because Westerman's head was in the way.
It's quite right. I wanted to flag, Mr. Davis, that actually Washington State is one of the few states that have stepped up and taken the invitation from Federal Highways to study road usage charges. And our Washington State Transportation Commission is currently launching a project involving some 2,000 drivers across the state, also partnering with Oregon and Idaho in this to look at road usage charges and how they might work. And some people will actually have an app on their phone to measure their miles. And they are
VMT?
Yeah, well, it's not necessarily by mileage. They're defining usage in a variety of different ways. They're actually looking at 3 different constructs so we can report back to this committee a variety of alternatives. They are also looking specifically at how that might work with electric vehicles, given the, as you pointed out, the greatly diminished fuel consumption of those vehicles and what the right charge for those vehicles might be.
Well, and I know my time is up, and I've got a question I'm going to send to you that I'd like to get answered on one of the programs, the stick apportionment. But anybody on the panel drive a fully electric vehicle? All right, no freeloaders. I yield back.
Mr. Lowenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I want to note the relative consensus in the testimony for today. Several of our panelists have highlighted, along with Congressman DeFazio, the need to stabilize the Highway Trust Fund, but also to seek additional revenue sources to fund needed infrastructure investment. I was glad to hear my colleague from Illinois call for diversification. I have proposed a dedicated funding stream for freight transportation so that projects can address bottlenecks and deficiencies in our goods movement network and that they can be financed by users of the freight infrastructure. So it's a user fee. My plan has bipartisan support and would raise approximately $8 billion a year for these investments. There may be other solutions. I'm glad to hear us talking about diversification. But there is a consensus that the status quo is simply inadequate to meet the challenges as we go forward in our infrastructure in the future. So, Mr. McKenna, I have a question for you first. Missouri's State Freight Plan notes that truck volume is projected to increase by over 50% between 2011 and 2030. Across the country, cargo volumes are up to record highs, and addressing this strain on our freight network is a key challenge in the years forward. I represent the port area in Long Beach, and adjacent to LA. We've had the highest amount of growth LA in years. Long Beach recently had the highest 1 month total. The question I have to you is, do you feel like states like yours, our key freight corridors, will have the resources they need to meet the increased volume without a dedicated freight infrastructure funding from the federal government?
Thank you for the question. I do not believe we have the resources required to meet that need. I don't believe we have the resources required at present to meet the current need. So we welcome the focus on freight. It is a critical aspect of our economy in the state, and we are focused on that element. We'll be bringing a infra grant forward as part of the discretionary program in the coming couple weeks, and we're focused on freight.
Thank you. Next question is for the entire panel. The FAST Act in 2015 created a new program to direct federal investment to critical freight infrastructure needs. However, the administration recently announced changes to that would reduce this program's emphasis on the most worthy projects and instead advantage projects with a low federal cost share. How does this new emphasis affect our ability to invest in critically needed freight infrastructure improvements now that we're just going to go to those that have the lowest federal cost? I'd like anybody to tell how we're going to deal with this issue. Mr. McCarty.
Yes, thank you. You know, as you start prioritizing things, what we have done in Missouri, and I'm sure it's done in other places, is we've had, as the director mentioned, we have these MPOs and these regional organizations that try to prioritize what their needs are. We don't have the luxury of trying to even analyze how much money we're getting back or what the match is. We're looking at where the needs really are. And really, the needs are really all over the place. From a manufacturer's standpoint, we want to make sure the entire system is connected, and I think that's important. So you have to look at connectivity as well.
But the question, and I agree with you completely about connectivity, and I believe a multimodal approach that really deals with connectivity is critically needed, so I concur with you. But I want to ask you about the administration's approach to now prioritize freight infrastructure by looking at those advantage programs that have a low federal cost share versus what was done in the FAST Act to look at the most worthy projects. That's quite a bit of difference. Anybody have any thoughts about what the administration has recently done? So it doesn't make any difference to you that we're going to just target those projects that have the smallest amount of federal cost sharing. Mr. McKenna?
I think what we're looking at is that they overlap. Those that are most significant to the state, most significant to the region, will also draw additional support from local share. We have a cost share program in our state, and that is playing out. So we're acting on a discretionary basis to look for those things that align both, that we can bring local resources to bear where we can and try to up our share.
Obviously, since the federal government is reducing its responsibility and has been, you have to look at other local sources. But do you agree that we should be looking at you said that you've kind of trying to do a balance between those that are both locally funded, larger cost share, and also those that are the most worthy projects. But I don't think that's where the administration has gone. They have not really talked about the most worthy projects. Okay, I yield back, thank you.
Mr. Lamalfa.
Thank you. Being another California member, we have a lot of issues we're trying to overcome there. The recent gas tax and vehicle registration tax have really has been really controversial. Some are seeing it as a windfall of dollars for these projects, but when it's written in such a way to not add a new lane, no new capacity, and a lot of that money is being diverted for other things, as well as the continued effort to invest in the high-speed rail system in California, which tripled in price from its original form and is still bound up by delays and all that. I think the people of California, when you talk about a gas tax increase of any sort, whether it's a statewide one or a federal one, the taxpayers will get fed up because they don't believe or trust the dollars will actually get to the highways, and that's what I'm very concerned about with California, that a small percentage of what is being foisted upon them will actually end up getting to the roads, with none of it being new capacity. So that said, the part of the area that isn't talked about enough is how do we make dollars that we already have in the stream go farther. In one of my other committees, Natural Resources Committee, we worked a bill through called H.R. 1654. It's the Water Supply Permitting Coordination Act, which created a one-stop shop for permitting process by establishing a lead agency, the Bureau of Reclamation, as the lead for reviews, permits, licenses, and other decisions which have to do with surface water storage projects. So what I'm looking for from this panel here, I would imagine you'd find that helpful for doing other types of infrastructure, building and repair. So maybe let's start with Mr. Roberts on that. You mentioned that the overlap on that was something that has brought frustration. What would you think, what would be some highlights which, if we were able to get a lead agency on road construction, repair, et cetera, how helpful would that be on timing as well as making dollars go farther?
Well, let me first address some of the concerns over SB 1, which would tie into some of the efficiencies that you question relative to the brand new bill that passed in California. Inside that $50 billion bill, there are instruments in there for congestion, and there are instruments in there for reduced or increased efficiencies. Interestingly enough, I agree that an oversight group that can bring in different areas of the government to create a more efficiency is appropriate. In the state of California, they just put an oversight group, an inspector group, over the top of the DOT to create more efficiencies and actually put into that last bill a reduction in the amount of money spent at the DOT to create efficiencies going forward to be able to enact the additional revenue that would be coming in.
Well, you still have to do a multi-stop alphabet soup of other agencies with permitting, with Fish and Wildlife, Fish and Game, EPA, whoever else might think they have a piece of that.
I agree. So what you're suggesting is the next phase. There was some efficiencies put into that bill, and then the next phase, I would agree, having an oversight, and I think the same thing would happen as we look into the environmental regulations that we see across the country, having some significant common oversight, whether it be for, as I mentioned in my testimony, whether it's for the Corps of Engineers with the Clean Water Act or the EIS studies through NEPA.
NEPA definitely, or California's own CEQA, yes, definitely, because there's unnecessary things that we're having to research. Go ahead, please.
But I agree. I think the fact that if you had some common oversight, you could create a lack of redundancies and some simplicity, which obviously is going to be more beneficial. And
well, what other things could we be doing in federally to further streamline that would complement what we've been talking about?
Well, number one, I thought would be the environmental side. It is by far the quickest, most economical way to do it is to tie in NEPA and the Corps of Engineers together, get the 404 permitting process sped up, and get the EIS system sped up.
All right. Mr. Rogoff, you were, did I say it correctly?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. The one-stop shop idea, you were talking about staffing up more so some of these agencies. Perhaps, I mean, we always have to find funding or have faith that staffing up will actually meet the road and getting the work done. Do you think with maybe a combined staffing up as well as the efficiency we're talking about, would we need nearly as much staff, or would one-stop shopping kind of accomplish both?
I don't know that it will accomplish both. I think the big concern, I would certainly agree that having a lead agency, a one-stop shop would have great benefits. The concern is that the imperatives of the other agencies not be cut off by some artificial deadline or be given short shrift. And those are the agencies, I'm talking about some small agencies like NOAA Fisheries, the folks in the Forest Service and Park Service, EPA, the Army Corps. They have different parts of the law that they must apply. They need to look at them, and unfortunately, sometimes there's been a culture that the only way that they could get their concerns attended to is by, throwing up a red flag or stopping a project. That culture needs to change. But I think if you're going to put people at ease that this could be done smartly and more quickly, we do need to make sure that they are sufficiently resourced to do the job. So I think your concept of combining streamlining with a staffing plan that gets funded by the appropriations subcommittees would be on point.
Well, it seemed like a lot more simultaneous coordination with one of the smaller ones, as you mentioned, telling the other ones, here's what we need, instead of a back-to-back chain, making it 5 years with each one getting their turn at.
Well, some positive steps have already been taken. For example, we at Sound Transit and other sponsors now, as a result of the FAST Act and some earlier authorities, are allowed to pay money to the federal agencies to help them staff up. The staff people we pay for cannot work on our documents, but they can work on other documents, freeing someone else up to work on our documents.
Okay, I'm sorry, my time's expired.
I'm sorry.
So, okay, no, you're good. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Lawrence.
I'm impressed by the panel that's been assembled. I'm impressed by this body displaying bipartisanship. It seems like all hands are on deck, but still we're in the same place of no action. Where is the sense of urgency? Where is the sense that how many times do we have to listen to experts? How many times do we have to listen to these eloquent speeches about how bipartisan we are? How many times do I have to hear Make America First? And knowing that if we check the box on investment in our infrastructure, we know that we will make sure that we have jobs in America, creating a skilled workforce. This is global competition. I know there's an international bridge that we're trying to build in Michigan, and they're talking about bringing in workforce from outside the country because we don't have enough trained. How long are we, as this elected body who was sent here to do something, will continue to sit here ad nausea and talk about it, and then watch our administration defund and not give us the proper amount of money? Clearly, we have experts, and we are experienced enough here in Congress to start moving the ball down the road. We know that we need to raise the gas tax. Check that box. We know we need to have PPP. We know that that is a part of the success of moving a transportation plan. We know that we need to work together. We got that. We have heard that allocation of funds, and we keep playing with numbers, and as if we just pulled numbers out of the air to say, okay, today it's $1 trillion, tomorrow it's 600 million. Where are we going to have that frustration that will move us forward and say, now it's time to do it? I just have one quick question that it's not really a question, but I need it for the record. Mr. Booker, you have, across this country, been one of the faces of building this workforce, of creating jobs. Can you please state for the record, if we as this country and this elected body and administration keep our word about investing in our infrastructure, how many jobs could we create in this country?
Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. And when you do it with long-term stability, of infrastructure funding, you're building the middle class. You're building skills for people that's going to last them a lifetime. You know, our training system is based on joint labor management participation, where we voluntarily, collectively, with our contractor partners, invest over $1 billion a year into our training system that goes on to hands-on training to our members. And how they get into the middle class and how they stay in the middle class is that they have a full-time job. They do their training at night. They do their training on the weekend. It's an earn-while-you-learn system. And I'm here representing over 2 million American workers in the construction industry today. And with long-term commitments, long-term shoring up of the Highway Transit Fund, of other mechanisms, is going to allow us to grow that, to maintain our baseline, and then allow us to grow it, that we're teaching skills for people that's going to last them a lifetime.
The fact of the matter is the average age of a skilled trade worker in America is 53 years old. We are facing a crisis in America where we're going to see a whole workforce retiring, and we have not invested. While we're having this frustrating conversation about how we invest in our infrastructure, we are sitting here watching a workforce diminish in front of us. If we get the funding, we also are going to have to stay focused on the fact that unemployment in America, minorities, veterans, women, it's this huge middle class opportunity and training in the skilled trades and the building trades. And so here it is, if we really are about making America great, not again, but continuing on our pathway of being a great country, we have to build that workforce. And we're going to have to get serious about this debate. I do not want another panel of experts talking to me. I want another panel of experts engaging as we start putting those shovels in the ground, as we start employing these young people to replace this aging workforce and to really invest. When we travel abroad, it is embarrassing the way that other countries that we consider not as sophisticated, not as advanced of us, are investing in their infrastructures, their rail, their roads, and here we are in America sitting around still kicking the can. It's time to go to work. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Westerman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. We know that all roads lead to somewhere, and there's a lot of talk about urban and rural, but really the roads connect our urban societies and our rural societies together, and our urban areas, like a lot of them here on the East Coast, are highly dependent on rural roadways to get goods and services to the population centers, and also to move manufactured products out of cities and across the country We all understand the importance of that. Mr. McKinney, your state of Missouri is to the north of Arkansas. You've got Interstate 49 that runs along the western side of Missouri up to Kansas City. Interstate 49 is a connector between New Orleans and Kansas City. The remaining undone part of Interstate 49 happens to be in my district. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of completing these projects and how that, even though you got this beautiful highway from the really from Fort Smith, Arkansas, all the way up to Kansas City, and from Ashdown, Arkansas, down to New Orleans, what having that two-lane curvy road undone means to the rest of the transportation on Interstate 49?
Thank you, Representative. Great question. We, as you mentioned, we have about 5 miles of interstate to complete, kind of a combined project between Missouri and Arkansas. And it just shows, you know, we are not complete even with the build out of the interstate system in its original capacity. But the benefits to the region itself, very substantially growing region in that part of the country, and the movement of freight and the movement of people and the economic well-being of that region is critically tied to that particular completion. You know, we are some $35 to $40 million away from that completion point, and that's one where when we allocate limited resources, both states have for 30 years, one state has had the funding and been ready and another state hasn't, and we've kind of traded places in that a couple times. It's frustrating for us. I know it's frustrating for you and your region, but these are the types of investments that can go a long way to really connect the people of the region as well as beyond the region, as you said, going all the way to New Orleans.
And really connecting to the rest of the world through the ports there in New Orleans. Do you believe the federal government gives an honest look at the entire system when they're designating funds for these new projects, or do you think there could be improvements there?
Well, I think the main issue is the amount of money coming into the top. You know, what we have in the region, we look at it and have discussions frequently that we have equitably distributed dissatisfaction throughout the whole system. That we are fair in our allocation. It's just not enough being allocated. We try to make the best decisions we can, but we're focused on critical maintenance and taking care of existing system and preservation beyond expansion at this point right now, and we need both.
Okay, and shifting gears a little bit, we're talking about different kinds of funding streams. I know from serving in my state legislature that in Arkansas at least, state and local taxes are collected on construction materials on projects that are funded with federal dollars. Now, Mr. McKenna, I think Missouri has an exemption for that where they exempt construction materials from state and local taxes. But since the communities where these infrastructure projects are built benefit from the infrastructure projects themselves, do you think it would be fair to ask state and local entities not to collect taxes on construction materials for projects that are funded with federal dollars? And I'd like to ask Mr. Roberts that question as well.
Well, I think what we really try to do is we do have a local cost share so that communities can actually raise local taxes. And what we've seen are communities have actually invested those in the federal system, in the state system, beyond their local municipalities. So we see a kind of a counteraction that occurs, so it kind of balances it out.
But ultimately, those state and local taxes are being paid with federal tax dollars if it's on a federally funded project. Mr. Roberts?
Yes, sir. I am not familiar with a location where the materials that we put into our projects are not taxed at the local level. So that would be surprising to me. So
one proposal that I may put out there is to exempt construction materials from state and federal taxes when federal tax dollars are funding those projects, so you have more money going for concrete and asphalt and bridges rather than going into state and local tax coffers. I yield back.
Mr. Poliatano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding a hearing on the critical need to increase investment in transportation infrastructure. And I am proud to join you and Ranking Member Norton, 235 of our bipartisan colleagues, in sending a letter to Ways and Means Committee urging them to fix the Highway Trust Fund revenue problem in order to provide sustained and sufficient funding for transportation. Thank you to all the witnesses. Your testimony highlighting the need for robust funding, both maintaining our existing infrastructure and new projects to address congestion, safety, and efficiency. I particularly want to thank Mr. Roberts from California. I often see the crews along the highways that I go almost on a daily basis when I'm home, and I appreciate the dangerous work you do. And our colleagues are in the transportation and the building trades. Your testimony highlights the American Society of Engineers report card that our nation's roads have a D and our nation's transit system a D-. American Society of Civil Engineers note that there is an $836 billion backlog of highway and bridge capital needs, with an additional $123 billion backlog for bridge repair, the $90 billion backlog on transit maintenance. I'm proud that the California legislature worked to address the transportation funding gap by passing SB 1, the $5.2 billion per year transportation spending package for 10 years. It's passed on a bipartisan basis. 2/3 of our legislators voted for, signed by Governor in April, but now some of our colleagues are challenging in court. Surprisingly, they're pursuing a ballot measure to repeal this important transportation funding. I ask unanimous consent, Mr. Chair, to insert into the record letters from California Fix Our Roads Coalition and the Transportation Construction Coalition opposing repeal of SB 1.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Roberts, can you discuss the infrastructure challenges facing California, and do you believe SB 1 is needed to address those challenges? How many jobs does SB 1 create in California, and the impact would be in repealing SB 1 on our state's economy?
Yes, ma'am. I would be happy to, because I think that SB 1 was probably one of the biggest legislative actions that I've seen in many, many years in the state of California.
Finally.
The backlog of work in California, as I mentioned before, is in excess of $100 billion itself in the state of California. It has been continually underfunded, and actually in the last several years it has been reduced, which is a tragedy. And I think that what's happening in the state of California is a microcosm of what's happening across the country. And so I want to go on record and make clear that the legislature stood up and did what we are hoping our federal government will do as well. And they used, as you suggest, a bipartisan approach to it, brought in discussions for several years. The governor, the leader of the state of California, put together the program at the end. They used a host of fees, and I think this is the important part. They did not focus just on gas tax. It has gas taxes, it has diesel tax, it has registration fees for electrical vehicles, for hybrid vehicles. So it used a host of opportunities, which we've been talking about all day here this morning, relative to making sure that we diversify the opportunity to create the funding mechanism. I think it would have been just absolutely devastating, or will be, if any kind of a repeal effort is successful, because today in California, we're in gridlock. And there was a question asked earlier about this does not address congestion. Well, it does address congestion. It doesn't address large expansion, but part of the congestion problem that we have across the country is the fact that we haven't properly maintained the systems that we have today.
For years.
Which is a significant issue in itself, and this is why I said previously that if you don't maintain what you had to begin with, you should not be putting more in place, because you're not going to maintain that properly either. I am excited also with Ms. Lawrence's comment that something of this significance, long-term, 10 years, $52 billion, will create an opportunity for people to move into the business of being in that industry and create careers so they can put money and food on the table for their families. And not just a short-term stimulus, but a long-term $52 billion program in the state of California that will change the construction industry for decades to come. So I want to congratulate the legislature and the governor for what I think is one of the biggest and strongest acts they've done in years.
Thank you very much. That is very true, and we are looking forward to more funding into an expansion of our freeways, because some of them are, well, more than 50 years old, and they're falling apart, not able to handle the type of transportation that is currently needed to get to work, get to deliver, and do all the other things. I find it sad that it took me, I was working for Ford Motor at the time, it took me 17 minutes from my house to my job back 20 years ago. Now it takes me an hour and a half. So it is important that we address the congestion, but also keep in mind that we need to address the backlog, the operation and maintenance, so that we have enough funding in reserve to be able to take care of that also. Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to talk about what we can do to restore some taxpayer confidence in the system. Mr. Booker, I think about all your members that we see out there working hard every day of the week. I mean, we've all had constituents call with those stories, dadgummit, Rob, I see 3 guys working, I see 40 guys standing around. I just don't understand it. I've got a little 2.5-mile stretch of road in my district. Preliminary engineering started on that road widening project back in 2005. Folks have been seeing orange cones out there for a decade. They wonder what in the world is going on. Why can't we get something done? What Mr. McKenna knows is that Russell McMurray, who leads our state DOT, presided over a project when the I-85 bridge burned down and collapsed in Georgia. 3 spans of bridge, not a square bridge, but a parabola of a bridge there, and we replaced it in 6 weeks. I didn't have one Tea Party, one conservative, one taxpayer advocate. I didn't have one constituent call and tell me they were angry about the $3 million performance bonus that we gave to C.W. Matthews for getting that job done 6 weeks, not just a 6-week project, but 6 weeks early on a 12-week project, and delivered what taxpayers believed was a value for their dollar. So you all represent a different facet of the industry. I tell that story all the time because it tells me what we can do together. Democratic mayor, bipartisan regional commission, Republican governor, all coming together to make those things happen. What's the story in your space that you would have me retell to tell folks, you know what, if you trust us with another $10 or $20 billion in the trust fund, we're not just going to flush it down the toilet. We're going to get you real value for real money. Who's got something to lift me up today? Mr. McKenna?
Yeah, I'll give you 2 examples, Representative. Number one, in Missouri, we have the same circumstance. We had major flooding in the spring. We had 384 roads closed. Our maintenance crews and our construction partners had 300 of those opened in 5 days. We're down to just 3, and we'll be complete by the end of this month. All 384 roads will be opened within 6 months of being closed. We also have a record of achievement. 4,661 construction projects have been completed by Missouri DOT and our construction partners in the last 10 years. 94% on time or early, and 7% under budget. That's $1 billion in savings, and that's gone right back into the construction program itself.
7% under budget?
7%.
Mr. Booker?
I would look to a project in Georgia at Plant Vogel, where we're building 2 new nuclear units, units 3 and 4, in Waynesboro, Georgia. Not an easy place to get to. We got 4,000 construction workers that go to work there every single day. I've spent more time than I probably should have done on that job site. And when you go around and you meet with them, whether it's on that project or any other project, our members, the construction workers, they want to work. They don't want to sit around. You know, the worst thing you can do on a 10-hour shift is only be busy for 4 hours. So our partnership with our contractor partners, how do you man your work? How do you manage that day? How do you do that? And if you go down to Waynesboro, you're going to see 4,000 people come out at the project every day. They can look behind them, see that they're building the future power for this country, and they're proud of what they're doing every day.
We thought they were going to be trendsetters. It remains to be seen whether that comes to fruition.
I still think they will.
Mr. Rogoff?
Well, I would point to projects that are really transformative, and I'd give you this example. We are surrounded by both water and mountains in the Puget Sound region, and as a result, we can take a lot off of a person's commute by having them avoid either the mountains or especially the water. So we just opened 2 additional stops to about a year ago this past March, goes to a neighborhood called Capitol Hill and Husky Stadium where the Washington Huskies play at the beginning of the university. We are continuing to go north from there. The ability to avoid the waterways and the roadways that have to hug those waterways meant that two-stop segment for many people to the heart of downtown Seattle went from more than 20 minutes on a good day and could be 40 minutes on a bad day to 8 minutes. It has completely changed commuting patterns. Our light rail ridership spiked beyond our expectations, some 70–80% with just 2 stops. It was a lot of money. It took a lot of time, but boy, it has transformed that region.
Yeah, I think about the elected officials who put the Atlanta-Hartsfield International Airport in over a lot of objections 45 years ago now, transformed the city of Atlanta in ways that no one could have ever imagined. I see the Trucking Association sitting on the back row. Their members are willing to pay more because they see the difference it makes in their day to maintain the roadways. I hope as we go on, you all will partner with me with those stories. It makes all the difference in the world when you feel like you're on a winning team instead of on a losing team. And I know folks are proud to show up to work every day. I want the taxpayers to be every bit as proud of that work that's going on. Your members deserve that. Your industry deserves that. And I think we can do that together. I thank you all for being here today. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, gentlemen, for your appearance today and for your testimony. Many people voted for Donald Trump because he promised to make America great again by growing the economy and creating high-paying middle-class jobs by rebuilding America's crumbling infrastructure. Isn't that correct, Mr. Booker?
That's correct.
And Mr. McKenna, do you believe that we can make America great again by rebuilding our roads, bridges, and tunnels if we replace real federal gas tax revenues with public-private partnerships?
I believe it requires we do both.
Do you believe that one would be, or public-private partnerships alone can do it?
Well, when I look to my left on this panel, public-private partnerships have existed in transportation for over 100 years. States, the federal government, and our construction industry. It's already in place.
Well, recently the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal reported that President Trump stated that he no longer believes that public-private partnerships will solve our infrastructure funding needs. Do you disagree with President Trump?
I believe it's part of a tool in the toolbox. It's a procurement method. It's not necessarily a funding method. It's one of the tools that might help particular projects in particular regions of the country.
Well, my colleague from Illinois, my good friend, Representative Davis, asked you all to raise your hands if you believe that raising the gas tax alone will take care of the problems with the Highway Trust Fund. And it was duly noted that no one raised their hand, and none of you on the panel raised your hand. I want you to raise your hand if you believe that the federal gas tax will remain viable for fixing our crumbling infrastructure, given the fact that we have 253 million gas-powered vehicles on the roads in the country today versus only 540,000 electric vehicles. Raise your hand if you believe that the federal gas tax will remain viable to fix our crumbling infrastructure.
I'm struggling with remain viable.
I see 4 out of 5 with the transit guy not raising his hand, and I would love to ask him about that in a second. Probably for a reason unrelated to the answer to the question. But I want you, so record reflects, you all believe that the gas tax is going to be viable. Now raise your hand if you believe that the gas tax should be increased. And I see 3, I see 4, I see 3, I see 4. I see a maybe out of one of the 4s. Mr. McCarty?
Yes, and the reason I'm hesitant is because I think it has to be part of an overall solution. It can be part of a package.
And that's not my question. My question is whether or not you believe that since 1993, gas tax has been at its current rate. Do you think it should be increased? That's my only question. And you did raise your hand, so do you wish to retract it at this time?
No, I think it has to be part of the package. As I said, we're looking for something that's sustainable long term, and fuel tax will be one of those things that we have to do.
All right, and so Mr. Rogoff, would you please solve this mystery for us, why you did not raise your hand on the question?
It's in part policy and it's in part parochial. As I pointed out earlier, the state of Washington has just increased its gas tax, the second increment of it, of a 12-cent gas tax increase. I work for a board of 17 elected officials. They do not, as I know, have a position on raising the gas tax. I would say this, importantly, transit is funded from a mix of trust fund dollars and general fund dollars. And in my written testimony, I talk about, I think, the need for transit expansion in America requires that we revisit the mix between programs. But I don't believe that all of the problems will be handled by a gas tax increase. And I think we probably should address the problems on a comprehensive basis, perhaps some combination of fuel taxes. I've also talked about the fact that Washington State is one of the few states that is actually piloting vehicle user charges. I think the committee needs to take a hard look at what will be sustainable, because the one thing you will hear unanimously from this panel is everyone wants sustainability and predictability in the program.
And thank you for that response. But I will ask whether or not these vehicle user fees are sufficient in rural areas.
I think the debate actually often goes in the other direction, which is to say rural users use the roadways more by definition, and how long it will take a rural resident to get to church or a shopping center versus an urban resident. The concern I have heard is that vehicle user charges can work a hardship on rural America, so I do not know that it would necessarily work in that case.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Being not on the subcommittee, but being allowed to participate, I much appreciate that. And under the committee rules, if you're not in the subcommittee, you're last. So I'd also appreciate what it was like to be a freshman once. So I'll remember that one day, the value of a 5-minute rule. Mr. Rogoff, as you know, I'm one of those voters who voted for the variety of taxes that we raised for the Sound Transit 3, or ST3, as we call it. And one of the issues that came up during that debate was about the federal obligation that we weren't going to do all of it, and taxpayers weren't going to carry all of this, but we're certainly going to carry most of it. There was an expectation there would be a federal obligation, but it was not going to be the full burden or half the burden. So now we're in this debate with the 2018 budget moving forward for ST2, for the completion of ST2. Can you just, how are you handling the uncertainty of the 2018 budget then that says that federal obligation may not be there to move forward?
Well, in a variety of measures, we are first evaluating for the benefit of the Sound Transit Board what our financing options would be. We have said definitively that we will get to Linwood, just as we will get to Federal Way and beyond, onto Everett and onto Tacoma, onto Redmond. I think the concern is, will the federal partnership leave, thus requiring local taxpayers to pay far more, and in so doing delay the project? We have already had to delay the delivery date for getting to Linwood from 2023 to 2024, and that was in part because of the uncertainty surrounding whether we will get a full funding grant agreement and the time frame in which we might get it. This recent appropriation cycle is a very good example. We were not successful in the House Appropriations Bill in securing dollars for Linwood. There is some funding in the Senate bill that we believe Linwood would be eligible for. And so we have to really watch the needle carefully, watch each step in the process, work with the FTA, work with our delegation, work with other transit agencies like ours. This is not just about Sound Transit. There are a number of other transit agencies around the country that similarly expect continued federal partnership. It was reasonable for them to do so. No one expected the administration to completely turn off the funding spigot, as no administration has done in the last 5 that I've worked with. But we are looking at our financing options while working very hard with members like yourself and the rest of the delegation in trying to move forward with a reasonable federal cost match.
Yeah, so just to put some perspective on that, again, the federal government turning off the federal funding spigot, but the local taxpayers' spigot is still running.
Absolutely.
Their obligation is still going with an expectation that there would be some help.
It is precisely what we told the voters, and you heard me earlier complain about being called out in the president's budget as reasons to terminate the federal participation. They also called out Los Angeles. They also called out Denver. The fact that all 3 of our regions passed local tax measures to fund transit, but the reality is all 3 of those had an expected federal component when we brought that to the voters. In the
An expected federal component that you had actually already talked to the federal authorities about.
Well, in the case of Linwood, we've already been admitted into the engineering phase with a commitment of $1.174 billion. I mean, this was laid out, and that's why the president's budget proposal came as more than a shock.
Yeah. You use TIFIA quite a bit, and that's in the FAST Act. I think we expanded the use of TIFIA as a non-direct federal funding mechanism. Can you just talk briefly about how you use TIFIA as a tool?
Sure.
As a valuable tool?
TIFIA is a very valuable tool, especially for agencies that have strong credit. And we pride ourselves, we believe we may have the strongest credit rating of any transit agency in the country. We use TIFIA to lower the cost of borrowing to the taxpayers. So we have, we believe, what may still be the only master credit agreement with the DOT for 4 separate TIFIA loans wrapped into one agreement. That by itself, over the course of those 4 loans, will save the taxpayers of Puget Sound between $200 to $300 million in borrowing costs. It's a great tool.
And what portion of that is mine and my wife's?
I'd have to divide it across all regional taxpayers, but
okay.
it benefits everyone.
Yeah, great. And then finally, I'll just note, when the I-35 bridge collapsed, and this is for everyone, I think for the record, if you can get back to us, when we had the I-35 collapse in Minneapolis, that sort of triggered Congress when we did the next transportation bill to write into the emergency bridge funding provisions in that next bill some emergency permitting procedures, which were first then used when the Skagit River Bridge collapsed in my district, and then they were used in Georgia as well, I think, as part of that collapse. Is there, from your perspective, and again, for the record, are there provisions in that emergency set of provisions for emergency bridge repair that can be maybe used as a lesson for some permitting streamlining as we try to craft a bill and look at permit streamlining? If you can come back to us for the record on that from the five of you, I'd appreciate it. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I've got a question it's a little parochial for Mr. McKenna, but for the committee overall. Missouri's received grants for the Surface Transportation Alternative Funding Program for 16 and 17. And I'd be curious, or if you could tell the committee too, what the progress is and how that's moving along and what your thoughts are.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, we did note that as part of the FAST Act, there was $95 million available for looking at alternatives to the fuel tax. We felt that our neighbors to the left and the right were doing a pretty good job of exercising the view toward vehicle miles traveled, and we wanted to look at something else. So we're looking at, in Missouri, the notion of a fuel economy-based adjustment to a registration fee, as another tool in the toolbox, as another means of strengthening our own revenue base in Missouri. So the first round of the grant, we received a small grant, $250,000. That was to study the demographics of the registration database, and that's gone very well. We should be done and concluded with that in December. We did just get the very good news that we get the next round, which is about $2.7 million, and we're going to be taking that information that we've gained from the first round, and we're really looking at the registration database in the state itself and looking to actually implement that type of registration fee. It would be a big upgrade for the state.
We had a lot of talk about, obviously, solvency of the trust fund moving forward, and I know Mr. Schuster and I both believe that we're going to have to do something different because the gas tax is extraordinarily regressive, and it's going to get more so and more so and more so. So we're very interested in alternatives and what we can look at moving forward. Second round. I know Mr. LaMalfa has a question. Go ahead, and then Ms. Horton wants to finish.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate that. I just wanted to clear out what a couple things meant for California on SB 1. It was called a bipartisan bill. There's 120 California legislators between the Assembly and the Senate. One Republican voted for SB 1 in the Senate. So if you want to call that a bipartisan bill, I don't have a lot to say about that, but and that individual's termed out and got a railway project for that individual's district. So under what is known as hashtag Fix Our Roads, 30% of the funding of SB 1 is going to go for other things besides roads like rail, transit, bikeways, pedestrian paths, parks and recreation, university research, workforce development programs. So when we go to the well and ask, you don't even ask the taxpayers because they do have a couple ballot measures they're looking at in California. Maybe they'll get asked. Tell the taxpayers to pay more for their roads and you have 30% going for other things, and it isn't bipartisan, you're really going to run into more problems coming back into D.C. and telling California legislators to try and vote for a new deal to foist more upon them. You know, again, 20 cents in diesel tax on top what truckers are already paying, yet truckers are not going to see any improvement from the new tax for their ability to move goods up and down the system. Families probably see about a $500 increase total cost per year if they're a multi-vehicle family and have any work or school to get their kids to. So, you know, there's real costs involved as we sit here and talk about increasing vehicle tax and fuel tax on everybody, whether it's a federal or state project. And finally, they had to even change the ballot summary because of the way it was rigged by the Attorney General in California. He went to court and they had to change the misleading ballot summary of what one of them that is getting ready to qualify, or I think has qualified, to go in front of the voters. So there's a lot of funny business with what is being placed in front of them. They can't even be honest about what it does. So that said, when we're talking about the who's going to bear the cost of the burden of paying for additional roads into the Highway Trust Fund or what have you, the issue of electric cars has come up a couple times on the panel here. In California's bill, there's an increase for $100 because you can't track fuel costs for electric cars. It doesn't even kick in until 2020 for the electric vehicles in California, $100. Meanwhile, everybody else is going to be paying $175 or approximately that, plus the gas tax. So we can't even seem to even out the burden on electric vehicles. But let me throw this to Mr. McKenna here. You know, as talking about getting more into the trust fund, with the increasing numbers of electric vehicles and hybrids and such, and subsidized by state and federal money, sometimes several thousands of dollars of these due to the incentives to buy those vehicles, they contribute a small fraction of what the cost is for using the same roads. So what do you see, Mr. McKenna, across the board, besides California's delayed until 2020, $100? What are you seeing in other states to try and have these vehicles that are wearing out the highways and roads the same as others but not paying any part of that burden?
Thank you for the question. That's actually what we're trying to address with the grant program that Chairman Graves mentioned. We're actually looking at a fuel economy adjustment to the registration fee. So if I'm receiving 40 miles per gallon on my vehicle and you're receiving 20 and we both drive 10,000 miles, you're paying double what I am. Our attempt through this grant program is to look at the ability to create a registration fee that would balance those two. So in fact, all users would be paying the same.
Okay. On one hand, that's funny because we've been cajoled and pushed and prodded into driving smaller, more fuel-efficient vehicles and all that, and then now that the money's running out into the trust fund, it's going back the other way. So how people that watch what we do, either at the state level or federal level, wonder what the heck they're supposed to do. It's got to be pretty confusing. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back. I appreciate the extra time.
Thank you, Mr. Graves. From Louisiana.
The other Mr. Graves. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it, and I want to thank you very much for having this hearing. I want to thank you all for being here today. I apologize I had to step out for a good bit of the hearing, but I did hear your testimony earlier. As we move forward in building an infrastructure package, I think something that's really important is for us to look at where we're spending infrastructure dollars today as a federal government. And I can go through and name various programs through, obviously, agencies like Department of Transportation, the Corps of Engineers, but many other agencies that are spending billions of dollars that I think are perhaps a bit off the radar. Agencies like Department of Agriculture, FEMA, Department of Commerce, Department of Interior, HUD, and many others. Do any of you have experience in using multiple funding streams and advancing an infrastructure solution that you're working on? Does that question make sense? Meaning integrating various federal funding streams to build a transportation project in your state?
Yes, Representative. We actually use multiple funding streams for almost every construction project we do, large or small. So a combination of federal, state, and local funds. We have a cost share program that can leverage actually local transportation development district sales taxes.
Let me see if I can clarify my question. Certainly you're going to be integrating state and local federal funding streams with federal because there's a cost share on many of these programs. Have you brought other federal streams to the table?
We do try to work with resource agencies. I can't think of any specific ones right now, but I know we have done that, and I could provide some for the record.
I would appreciate it. Could anyone else?
Sure. We certainly have been combined dollars from the Federal Transit Administration with things like CMAQ dollars, congestion mitigation, air quality dollars from the Federal Highway Administration. I think what you'll often see is dollars from other agencies pay for some of the augmentation that surrounds our projects, like CDBG through HUD and the kind of redevelopment a community might do around a rail station. It's part of an overall build out of a structure, but they might be considered segmented projects.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Chairman, as we move forward and continue having discussions about infrastructure, I just think it's critical that we have a clear inventory of various federal efforts that are underway now under all these different agencies that are advancing different infrastructure objectives, and in many cases, I think perhaps objectives that aren't as high priority as others. If we're spending money and making up something, if we're building recreational opportunities in some states using an infrastructure pot, is that really advancing a federal objective? A lot of people, when you talk infrastructure package, I think are expecting to see this rain of federal dollars that are going to come into states. I think one of the first things we need to do is get an inventory of where we're spending dollars now and a better understanding of how those dollars are being spent, if they're truly advancing a federal priority or not, and doing a better job at truly funding projects or funding initiatives within the federal government, as opposed to taking more of a shotgun approach where we sprinkle dollars out in insufficient amounts all over the United States. Let me ask another question. You talked, Mr. Rogoff, you obviously have strong transit background. I've ridden on a number of your rail vehicles in the Seattle area. How do you do your planning? You talked about how you're able to project the number of cars coming off roads and things like that as a result of different investments you're making. How do you integrate your planning with your state DOT to make sure that you're making complementary investments with your transit dollars as compared to other highway dollars?
It's a great question, and we're frankly rather proud of our record and how we come at this. So first, as I said, the legislation that authorizes us, we have to go to the legislature to get authority to go to the voters to ask for a revenue increase and a system plan.
that was effectively the state highway bill. So we knew what the state's plans were before we then went out to the voters. We have the added benefit that the State Transportation Secretary is a member of my board. We work hand in glove with them in part because a lot of the projects we are running, new rail extensions, are actually happening over interstate right-of-way adjacent to either I-5. We're also literally building light rail over a floating bridge that is Interstate 90. So we are working, in fact, a number of the state DOT staff will now be co-located on in our office spaces so we can work even better together. So there's always improvements to make on the integration, but we only want the taxpayers to pay for the benefit once, and we're working very hard to make sure that takes place. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I have a couple other questions I'm going to submit in writing. Thank you very much. Yield back.
Absolutely. Seeing no other questions, I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today and for your testimony. I would also ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to the questions that have been submitted to them. And I would also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for additional comments and information submitted by members and witnesses to be included in today's record. Without objection, that is so ordered. And no other members have anything to add. The committee stands adjourned. Thank you.